I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. I needed to get away from the city, from the noise, from the constant pressure of work and life. I chose a spot I had found on an old hiking blog, somewhere deep in the forest of the northern mountains. It was supposed to be remote, unfrequented, and perfect for disconnecting. I packed carefully, making sure I had enough food, water, and supplies for at least 3 days. My backpack was heavy, but not too heavy. I knew I'd be hiking several miles to reach the site. I had a small tent, a sleeping bag, a portable stove, a first aid kit, and extra batteries. I double-checked everything before leaving, making sure nothing was forgotten. The drive to the trailhead took longer than expected because the roads became narrower and bumpier as I moved further from the town. Eventually, the paved road ended and turned into gravel, then dirt, then a barely noticeable path through trees. I parked my car and strapped on my backpack. The air smelled different here, clean, earthy, and damp with the scent of pine and moss. The forest was quiet except for occasional birds and the distant rustling of leaves. It felt peaceful but also isolating. The hike to my campsite took nearly 4 hours. I followed a narrow trail that twisted through dense woods, sometimes climbing steep hills, sometimes descending into shallow valleys. The sunlight filtered through the canopy in thin, uneven rays, illuminating patches of green moss and ferns. I passed a few small streams and had to carefully step on slippery rocks to cross. My legs ached, but I welcomed the fatigue. It reminded me I was far from civilization and relying on myself. By the time I reached the clearing I had read about, the sun was starting to drop low in the sky. The clearing was small, roughly the size of a soccer field, surrounded on all sides by tall, thick trees. A shallow creek ran along one side, its water clear and fast-moving. The ground was soft and slightly damp, covered in a mix of pine needles and fallen leaves. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, close enough to the creek for easy water access but far enough that the ground was dry. Setting up the tent took longer than expected because the ground was uneven, but I managed. Once the tent was ready, I collected firewood. The forest floor was littered with small branches and dry twigs, but I had to be careful to find pieces that were dry enough to burn. I started a small fire using my lighter and kindling, and soon I had a modest flame flickering. I cooked a simple meal, canned beans heated on my portable stove, and ate slowly, savoring the quiet and the smell of the fire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest darkened quickly. Shadows stretched across the clearing, and the temperature dropped. I zipped up my sleeping bag halfway and added an extra layer, feeling the chill in the air. Night in the forest is different than night in a city. There's no artificial light, no hum of electricity, no distant cars. Just darkness, broken occasionally by the faint reflection of the moon or the sudden flicker of my fire. And the sounds, sudden snaps of twigs, rustling in the leaves, the faraway cry of an owl. At first, they were calming, part of the wilderness I had come to experience. But as the night went on, the sounds felt closer, sharper, more immediate. My imagination began to fill in details that weren't there. Every small noise made me tense. I reminded myself to stay calm. I had a flashlight, extra batteries, and I knew my way back in daylight. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound I didn't recognize. It wasn't the usual rustle of leaves or the distant animal calls. It was a soft, irregular crunching, like someone or something was stepping over broken branches nearby. I froze, straining my ears. My fire had mostly died down, leaving only a faint glow. I listened carefully, hearing the sound again, closer this time. I couldn't see anything through the tent walls, just shadows pressed against the fabric as the wind moved the trees. My heart began to pound. I reminded myself that the forest was full of animals. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear. But something about this sound didn't feel right. I grabbed my flashlight quietly and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the edge of the clearing and the trees beyond. For a moment I saw nothing. Then I noticed a movement, a shadow low to the ground, moving between the trees. My first thought was an animal, maybe a coyote or a small bear. But the movement was too careful, deliberate, almost like someone was watching me. I sat back, trying to calm myself. I didn't want to panic, and I didn't want to make a noise that could attract attention. I remembered that, in these situations, staying calm is the most important thing. I decided to wait and watch. I turned off my flashlight to avoid being seen, relying only on the faint glow of the embers. I stayed as still as possible, listening. The crunching continued intermittently, closer to the clearing. My mind ran through possible scenarios. Someone lost, a hiker who had wandered off the trail, an animal. Suddenly, the sound stopped. Complete silence. That silence was heavier than the noise. I couldn't hear the creak, couldn't hear the usual rustle of leaves. Just nothing. I stayed frozen, my breathing shallow. After what felt like an eternity, I heard it again, this time much closer, right at the edge of the clearing. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I had to make a choice. Stay in the tent and risk being trapped, or leave and try to make noise to scare off whatever it was. I decided to stay put. I checked my backpack for my bear spray. It was supposed to be for bears, but it would work on anything. I held it close, ready. I turned on my flashlight for a brief second to check my surroundings, then quickly turned it off. That's when I noticed something on the edge of the clearing. Footprints. Fresh footprints, large, deep impressions in the mud. Not animal tracks, human. Whoever or whatever had been moving around was big. Too big to be a lost hiker. My stomach dropped. I realized that I might not be dealing with a curious animal at all. I stayed in the tent for hours, not moving, barely breathing, listening as the night stretched on. The footprints never moved closer, but I could hear more movement around the clearing, soft, cautious steps, breaking small branches, occasionally scraping against the trees. I didn't dare make a sound. Dawn couldn't come soon enough. When the first light of morning finally seeped through the trees, I carefully unzipped the tent and peered outside. The forest looked peaceful in the daylight, serene even, but the footprints were still there, clear in the damp soil. They led away from the clearing, back into the denser forest. Whoever had been there had left, at least for now. My relief was immediate, but I didn't let my guard down. I packed my tent and supplies as quickly and quietly as I could, constantly scanning the tree line. I followed the trail back toward the trailhead, my pace brisk. Every rustle, every bird call made me tense, but the path was familiar. Hours later, I reached my car. I double-checked that everything was locked and secure before getting inside. I sat there for a long moment, catching my breath, listening to the engine, and finally feeling safe again. The forest seemed distant now, a memory rather than a living presence. That night, back in my own bed, I thought about what had happened. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had been hiking nearby, maybe even hiding for reasons I couldn't understand. But the size of the footprints, the way the movement had circled the clearing, made it hard to convince myself it was harmless. I realized how quickly a peaceful situation could turn into something threatening. I decided I would return to the forest someday, but not alone, and not without a plan to stay completely safe. I had survived, but I had learned a lesson about the fragility of safety in the wilderness. Looking back, I can see the forest differently now. It is beautiful, yes, but it is unpredictable. It does not conform to our expectations. It can feel calm and welcoming in one moment and suffocatingly dangerous the next. That night, I understood what it truly meant to be isolated, alone, and at the mercy of forces beyond my control. But I also learned that preparation, calm thinking, and respect for the unknown are what keep you alive. I never saw the person or animal that had been near my campsite again. The footprints faded with the sun and wind. I returned to civilization tired, shaken, and full of a new respect for the wilderness. The fear I had felt remained, but it was tempered by a clear sense of survival and awareness. The story of that night stays with me, a constant reminder that even in places we think are empty and safe, there is always a reality far more complex and dangerous than we imagine. I had been planning this camping trip for months, mapping out the route, checking weather patterns, and making sure I had all the gear I could possibly need. The idea was simple: a long weekend deep in the forest, away from any roads, any people, and any sound that wasn't natural. I wanted isolation, solitude, and the kind of quiet that can make your own thoughts seem loud. I wasn't looking for adventure in the conventional sense. No rock climbing, no canyons, no rivers to cross. Just a small patch of wilderness, a tent, and me. I packed my car carefully the night before I left. I made sure my food was enough for 3 days, mostly non-perishable items. Canned beans, rice, jerky, energy bars, a loaf of dense whole grain bread. I had a water filtration system, extra bottles, a heavy-duty stove, and plenty of fuel. My sleeping bag was rated for cold weather. The forecast said clear skies, but the temperature could drop sharply at night. I also had a first aid kit, flashlight, spare batteries, rope, knife, a compact axe, and even a small handheld GPS as a backup. I knew I had overprepared, but I also knew the forest could be unpredictable. The drive-in was long and quiet. I left early in the morning, the road still slick with dew, the air crisp and cool. The forest got denser as I drove further from the highway. I passed a few signs warning about wildlife, bears, coyotes, mountain lions, but I didn't feel afraid. I felt aware, cautious, but not panicked. By the time I reached the point where the road ended and the trail began, the sun was already high in the sky, filtering through the dense canopy and casting irregular shadows on the ground. I parked the car, double-checked that all my gear was secure, and hoisted the backpack onto my shoulders. The trail was narrow and winding, and I moved slowly, deliberately. The further I went, the less the forest seemed like a place for people. I noticed the subtle sounds: a twig snapping under a distant animal's weight, the rustle of leaves as squirrels moved through the branches, the occasional distant call of a hawk. I felt alive, alert. I kept track of the landmarks, the large mossy boulders, the fallen tree that spanned the creek, the small hill that overlooked a clearing. I wanted to be able to find my way back even if I didn't have GPS. After about 3 hours of hiking, I found the clearing I had been hoping for. It was small but flat, surrounded by thick trees on all sides. The ground was firm and dry, covered in pine needles, with a small, shallow stream trickling nearby. I dropped my backpack, unrolled my sleeping mat, and started to set up the tent. It was sturdy, the kind that could withstand wind and rain, and I secured it carefully, making sure all the stakes were driven deep into the ground. Once the tent was up, I arranged my gear inside, organized the food, and set up a small area outside for cooking. I spent the next hour gathering firewood. I wanted a fire that would last through the night, both for warmth and for safety. I found dry sticks, split some larger logs with my axe, and stacked everything neatly. I was meticulous. I didn't want to be caught scrambling in the dark if the temperature dropped or if an animal wandered too close. Once the fire was lit, I sat back and watched the flames dance, feeling a rare sense of calm and satisfaction. The first night was uneventful, almost serene. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the forest's night symphony. The gentle flow of the stream, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl. I felt completely alone, yet safe, insulated from the outside world by the walls of my tent and the firelight. I slept deeply, without dreams, my mind uncluttered. The next morning, I woke to a thin layer of frost on the grass and a sharp chill in the air. I ate a simple breakfast of oatmeal and jerky, boiled water from the stream, and packed a small day pack with essentials for a hike I had planned deeper into the forest. The day was bright, the sunlight piercing the canopy in beams, creating a patchwork of light and shadow on the forest floor. I followed a trail I hadn't scouted before, moving cautiously but confidently. The forest seemed denser here, older, with massive trees whose trunks were thick with moss and vines. Occasionally, I would see signs of animals, hoof prints in the soft earth, claw marks on the bark of a tree, or small piles of droppings, but nothing threatening. I reminded myself to stay calm, to respect the wildlife, and to keep my senses sharp. By midday, I realized I had wandered further than I anticipated. The trail became less defined, and at some points it disappeared entirely. I took mental notes of the landmarks, distinctive trees, rocks, fallen logs, and adjusted my pace, making sure to avoid exhaustion. My stomach growled, and I stopped to eat a few energy bars. That's when I noticed something unusual. The tracks. Not animal tracks, but human footprints. They were recent, and they didn't follow the trail. They veered off into the forest. I felt a small spike of unease. I paused, scanning the area. There was no sound other than the stream and the wind through the trees. I tried to reason with myself it could be hunters or hikers, but a part of me remained alert, aware that being alone in a forest, even in a well-prepared way, always carried risks. I decided to follow the footprints cautiously, thinking they might lead to a secondary trail. The prints led deeper into a part of the forest I hadn't intended to explore. As I walked, the air grew cooler, denser. The sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, and the forest floor was uneven, covered in roots and moss. I stumbled a few times, my hands scraping against bark and rocks. The footprints continued, sometimes pausing as if the person had lingered, sometimes merging with what looked like animal tracks. I noticed broken branches, as if someone had forced their way through the underbrush. A sense of tension settled over me. I reached a small clearing near the edge of a steep ravine. The footprints ended abruptly. I looked around. There was no sign of the person, no sound, only the wind moving through the trees. I felt exposed, as if the forest itself was watching. I took out my GPS, noting my coordinates, and decided to return to my campsite immediately. The hike back was slower. Every sound, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, even the movement of the wind, felt amplified. My heart rate increased. I realized that being alone made every small detail seem monumental. When I finally returned to the clearing where I had set up camp, relief washed over me. The tent was intact. The fire was cold, but nothing had been disturbed. I quickly checked my food supplies, the water, and my gear. Everything was in place. I made a small fire, sat close to it, and tried to calm my racing mind. I knew that spending the night here could be unnerving, but leaving in the dark through unfamiliar terrain was far more dangerous. Night fell. The forest transformed into an alien landscape of shadows and shapes. I kept my flashlight close, the beam cutting through the darkness in narrow lines. I double-checked the tent's zippers, the perimeter of the campsite, and kept the axe within reach. Sleep did not come easily. Every sound, the distant howl of a coyote, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, made me tense. I reminded myself that fear could cloud judgment and that patience and awareness were my greatest allies. Around midnight, I heard something different. Footsteps, not close but deliberate. Heavy, measured steps moving through the underbrush. My heart leapt. I stayed still, quiet, holding my breath. The sound came closer, paused, then receded. It was enough to remind me that isolation is a double-edged sword. The forest is beautiful, but it is indifferent, and humans are not always predictable. The next morning, I made a plan to leave. I ate a quick breakfast, packed everything meticulously, and followed the trail I had used before. I kept my senses sharp, moving quickly but carefully. Along the way, I found additional signs that someone had been nearby. Broken branches, footprints leading in various directions, and small items that looked like they had been dropped. I kept moving, knowing that the longer I stayed, the greater the risk of encountering someone whose intentions I could not gauge. By the time I reached the car, I felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. I loaded the gear, checked my surroundings, and started the engine. The drive back was slow, my mind replaying every sound, every shadow, every detail of the last 2 days. I realized that the forest is not inherently dangerous, but isolation amplifies every uncertainty, and humans can be unpredictable even in the wild. Once I returned to civilization, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. I had experienced true solitude, faced fear without panicking, and respected the forest without underestimating it. I had also learned a critical lesson. Preparation, awareness, and patience are essential, and understanding that danger can come not just from nature, but from other humans, is vital. The trip had been tense, even frightening at times, but it ended clearly and safely because I stayed focused, respected my limits, and made deliberate decisions at every step. I unpacked my gear at home, cleaned everything, and carefully documented my route. noting every detail of the forest, the trails, and the unusual signs I had encountered. I knew I could go back someday, but the memory of that second night, the footsteps in the dark, the oppressive weight of being alone, would always stay with me. It was a story of survival, awareness, and the kind of fear that sharpens the mind rather than paralyzes it. I had faced the forest and come through it intact, fully aware of the real dangers that exist when you step into the wild. I paused, scanning the area. There was no sound other than the stream and the wind through the trees. I tried to reason with myself, it could be hunters or hikers, but a part of me remained alert, aware that being alone in a forest, even in a well-prepared way, always carried risks. I decided to follow the footprints cautiously, thinking they might lead to a secondary trail. The prints led deeper into a part of the forest I hadn't intended to explore. As I walked, the air grew cooler, denser. The sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, and the forest floor was uneven, covered in roots and moss. I stumbled a few times, my hands scraping against bark and rocks. The footprints continued, sometimes pausing as if the person had lingered, sometimes merging with what looked like animal tracks. I noticed broken branches, as if someone had forced their way through the underbrush. A sense of tension settled over me. I reached a small clearing near the edge of a steep ravine. The footprints ended abruptly. I looked around. There was no sign of the person, no sound, only the wind moving through the trees. I felt exposed, as if the forest itself was watching. I took out my GPS, noting my coordinates, and decided to return to my campsite immediately. The hike back was slower. Every sound, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, even the movement of the wind, felt amplified. My heart rate increased. I realized that being alone made every small detail seem monumental. When I finally returned to the clearing where I had set up camp, relief washed over me. The tent was intact. The fire was cold, but nothing had been disturbed. I quickly checked my food supplies, the water, and my gear. Everything was in place. I made a small fire, sat close to it, and tried to calm my racing mind. I knew that spending the night here could be unnerving, but leaving in the dark through unfamiliar terrain was far more dangerous. Night fell. The forest transformed into an alien landscape of shadows and shapes. I kept my flashlight close, the beam cutting through the darkness in narrow lines. I double-checked the tent's zippers, the perimeter of the campsite, and kept the axe within reach. Sleep did not come easily. Every sound, the distant howl of a coyote, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, made me tense. I reminded myself that fear could cloud judgment and that patience and awareness were my greatest allies. Around midnight, I heard something different. Footsteps, not close but deliberate. Heavy, measured steps moving through the underbrush. My heart leapt. I stayed still, quiet, holding my breath. The sound came closer, paused, then receded. It was enough to remind me that isolation is a double-edged sword. The forest is beautiful, but it is indifferent, and humans are not always predictable. The next morning, I made a plan to leave. I ate a quick breakfast, packed everything meticulously, and followed the trail I had used before. I kept my senses sharp, moving quickly but carefully. Along the way, I found additional signs that someone had been nearby. Broken branches, footprints leading in various directions, and small items that looked like they had been dropped. I kept moving, knowing that the longer I stayed, the greater the risk of encountering someone whose intentions I could not gauge. By the time I reached the car, I felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. I loaded the gear, checked my surroundings, and started the engine. The drive back was slow, my mind replaying every sound, every shadow, every detail of the last 2 days. I realized that the forest is not inherently dangerous, but isolation amplifies every uncertainty, and humans can be unpredictable even in the wild. Once I returned to civilization, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. I had experienced true solitude, faced fear without panicking, and respected the forest without underestimating it. I had also learned a critical lesson. Preparation, awareness, and patience are essential, and understanding that danger can come not just from nature, but from other humans, is vital. The trip had been tense, even frightening at times, but it ended clearly and safely because I stayed focused, respected my limits, and made deliberate decisions at every step. I unpacked my gear at home, cleaned everything, and carefully documented my route, noting every detail of the forest, the trails, and the unusual signs I had encountered. I knew I could go back someday, but the memory of that second night, the footsteps in the dark, the oppressive weight of being alone, would always stay with me. It was a story of survival, awareness, and the kind of fear that sharpens the mind rather than paralyzes it. I had faced the forest and come through it intact, fully aware of the real dangers that exist when you step into the wild. I had been planning this camping trip for months, mapping out the route, checking weather patterns, and making sure I had all the gear I could possibly need. The idea was simple: a long weekend deep in the forest, away from any roads, any people, and any sound that wasn't natural. I wanted isolation, solitude, and the kind of quiet that can make your own thoughts seem loud. I wasn't looking for adventure in the conventional sense. No rock climbing, no canyons, no rivers to cross. Just a small patch of wilderness, a tent, and me. I packed my car carefully the night before I left. I made sure my food was enough for 3 days, mostly non-perishable items. Canned beans, rice, jerky, energy bars, a loaf of dense whole grain bread. I had a water filtration system, extra bottles, a heavy-duty stove, and plenty of fuel. My sleeping bag was rated for cold weather. The forecast said clear skies, but the temperature could drop sharply at night. I also had a first aid kit, flashlight, spare batteries, rope, knife, a compact axe, and even a small handheld GPS as a backup. I knew I had over-prepared, but I also knew the forest could be unpredictable. The drive-in was long and quiet. I left early in the morning, the road still slick with dew, the air crisp and cool. The forest got denser as I drove further from the highway. I passed a few signs warning about wildlife, bears, coyotes, mountain lions, but I didn't feel afraid. I felt aware, cautious, but not panicked. By the time I reached the point where the road ended and the trail began, the sun was already high in the sky, filtering through the dense canopy and casting irregular shadows on the ground. I parked the car, double-checked that all my gear was secure, and hoisted the backpack onto my shoulders. The trail was narrow and winding, and I moved slowly, deliberately. The further I went, the less the forest seemed like a place for people. I noticed the subtle sounds: a twig snapping under a distant animal's weight, the rustle of leaves as squirrels moved through the branches, the occasional distant call of a hawk. I felt alive, alert. I kept track of the landmarks: the large mossy boulders, the fallen tree that spanned the creek, the small hill that overlooked a clearing. I wanted to be able to find my way back even if I didn't have GPS. After about 3 hours of hiking, I found the clearing I had been hoping for. It was small but flat, surrounded by thick trees on all sides. The ground was firm and dry, covered in pine needles, with a small, shallow stream trickling nearby. I dropped my backpack, unrolled my sleeping mat, and started to set up the tent. It was sturdy, the kind that could withstand wind and rain, and I secured it carefully, making sure all the stakes were driven deep into the ground. Once the tent was up, I arranged my gear inside, organized the food, and set up a small area outside for cooking. I spent the next hour gathering firewood. I wanted a fire that would last through the night, both for warmth and for safety. I found dry sticks, split some larger logs with my axe, and stacked everything neatly. I was meticulous. I didn't want to be caught scrambling in the dark if the temperature dropped or if an animal wandered too close. Once the fire was lit, I sat back and watched the flames dance, feeling a rare sense of calm and satisfaction. The first night was uneventful, almost serene. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the forest's night symphony. The gentle flow of the stream, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl. I felt completely alone, yet safe, insulated from the outside world by the walls of my tent and the firelight. I slept deeply, without dreams, my mind uncluttered. The next morning, I woke to a thin layer of frost on the grass and a sharp chill in the air. I ate a simple breakfast of oatmeal and jerky, boiled water from the stream, and packed a small day pack with essentials for a hike I had planned deeper into the forest. The day was bright, the sunlight piercing the canopy in beams, creating a patchwork of light and shadow on the forest floor. I followed a trail I hadn't scouted before, moving cautiously but confidently. The forest seemed denser here, older, with massive trees whose trunks were thick with moss and vines. Occasionally, I would see signs of animals, hoof prints in the soft earth, claw marks on the bark of a tree, or small piles of droppings, but nothing threatening. I reminded myself to stay calm, to respect the wildlife, and to keep my senses sharp. By midday, I realized I had wandered further than I anticipated. The trail became less defined, and at some points it disappeared entirely. I took mental notes of the landmarks, distinctive trees, rocks, fallen logs, and adjusted my pace, making sure to avoid exhaustion. My stomach growled, and I stopped to eat a few energy bars. That's when I noticed something unusual. The tracks. Not animal tracks, but human footprints. They were recent, and they didn't follow the trail. They veered off into the forest. I felt a small spike of unease. I had been planning the trip for months, trying to find a spot that was far enough from civilization to feel truly alone, yet not so remote that I would be risking myself unnecessarily. I wasn't looking for adventure in a dramatic way. I just wanted to be out in the wild, away from the constant buzz of the city, away from people, away from anything that could reach me in an instant. I picked a section of forest in the northern part of the state that I hadn't visited before. From what I read online and on maps, the trail ended at a small, isolated clearing by a stream, and from there it was untouched forest stretching for miles. No cabins, no hunting lodges, no visible human interference. I wanted that kind of solitude, and I wanted it badly enough that I didn't mind doing a long, exhausting hike to reach it. I left my apartment just before dawn, my backpack loaded with the basics: tent, sleeping bag, water filter, some food, first aid supplies, a flashlight, extra batteries, and a hatchet. I also carried a small folding saw and a multi-tool just in case. My phone had a full battery and a power bank, but I knew it would lose signal once I got too far in. That was fine. I wanted it that way. I drove for 3 hours on winding roads, finally parking at a small pullout near the trailhead. The morning was cool and crisp, the kind of air that smelled clean and sharp, almost metallic, and it filled me with a quiet thrill as I slung my backpack over my shoulder and stepped onto the dirt path. The hike started easy. The trail was narrow but clear, with sunlight filtering through the leaves in long, dappled streaks. Birds were singing above me, and the smell of wet earth mixed with the faint aroma of pine needles was intoxicating. Every few minutes I'd hear twigs snapping behind me, but I convinced myself it was just the wind or small animals. I passed a couple of tiny creeks and had to navigate over fallen logs, but none of it felt threatening. The further I went, the more I felt a tension in my chest that I couldn't explain, an awareness that I was leaving safety behind, that every step was taking me farther from the world I knew. But the feeling was exhilarating as well. By noon, the trail became harder. The path narrowed to just a faint strip of dirt, and branches scratched at my arms and face as I pushed through. The air was thick and still, and I noticed fewer birds and insects. Even the wind seemed to have died. I crossed a shallow stream by hopping on stones, and I remember pausing there for a long time, looking at the water. It was clear, cold, rushing quietly over smooth rocks, but there was a smell of rot underneath it. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the leaves and mud, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Around mid-afternoon, I finally reached the clearing. It was smaller than I imagined, maybe 30 feet across, ringed by tall, dense trees that blocked any view beyond. The stream ran along one edge, and the ground was uneven, covered in a mixture of grass, moss, and fallen branches. I could see the marks of wild animals, the shallow footprints of deer, claw marks on tree trunks, and the occasional scat. I picked a spot near the stream to set up my tent, close enough to hear the water but far enough that a sudden rise in the water wouldn't be a problem. I unpacked methodically, laying out the sleeping bag, assembling the tent, and stacking some kindling nearby. I decided to make a small fire to cook my dinner, even though I had instant noodles and granola bars. The act of gathering dry wood and striking the lighter against the flint gave me a sense of control, and soon the flames were flickering, throwing shadows across the clearing. The warmth felt good against the cool evening air, and I was proud of myself for having made it this far. I ate slowly, listening to the water and the faint rustle of trees around me. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest darkened quickly. Shadows stretched unnaturally, twisting with the flicker of the fire. I had brought a lantern, but I kept it off for now, preferring to let my eyes adjust to the dark. That's when I first heard the sound. At first, it was soft, almost imperceptible. A snapping twig, distant but deliberate. I froze. My heart thumped loudly in my chest. I told myself it was a deer or some other animal, moving through the underbrush, but the sound was too rhythmic, too intentional. Another snap, closer this time. I turned slowly in a circle, scanning the tree line, but I saw nothing. I kept my movements slow, controlled. I grabbed my hatchet from the ground beside me and held it loosely, a way to calm my nerves. The snapping continued intermittently, always from different directions, always at a distance that kept me guessing. I realized then that the forest had changed. It wasn't just dark. It felt enclosed, like the trees themselves were pressing inward, watching. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, but I told myself I had come too far. I set the hatchet down beside me and stared into the darkness, my ears straining for any additional sound. Around 9 o'clock, I tried to sleep. I lay inside my tent, zipped up completely, but sleep didn't come. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch, every faint shuffle outside made my heart jump. I imagined a bear, a mountain lion, or some other predator creeping just beyond the small circle of light from my fire. I told myself I had left civilization, and that nature was dangerous, and that this was part of the experience. But I also realized that I hadn't accounted for how completely powerless I would feel when I was truly alone. The first encounter came just after midnight. I had dozed lightly when a sudden, loud crash woke me. My tent shook slightly. My fire had burned down to embers, and I could barely see beyond the edge of the clearing. I sat up slowly, listening. There it was again, a heavy, deliberate movement, like something large was stepping on the underbrush around my clearing. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, sweeping the beam through the trees. My eyes caught movement, something dark and large, moving between the trunks. I couldn't identify it. My mind raced. I had trained myself to stay calm in emergencies, but this was something primal. I thought about making noise, banging sticks, or calling out, but I also knew that might provoke an attack if it was a wild animal. I remembered the hatchet at my side, and I gripped it tightly. The creature, or whatever it was, kept circling the clearing. I could hear heavy breathing, the crack of twigs, the occasional scrape of claws on a tree. Hours passed. Every few minutes, I caught movement in the shadows. I didn't sleep. I huddled in my tent, trying to make myself as small as possible, keeping the hatchet close and the flashlight pointed toward the dark. The sounds never stopped. I began to feel the panic rising, a deep, cold terror I hadn't anticipated. My chest tightened, my hands shook, and I could barely think straight. I thought about trying to leave, but the forest was dense, the trail invisible in the darkness, and I didn't know what I would stumble into if I stepped outside. At dawn, I made a decision. I packed as quickly as I could, leaving nothing behind except the remnants of the fire. The forest was still eerily quiet, and I noticed that the movement I had heard during the night was gone. I kept my hatchet ready and my flashlight on, moving cautiously toward the trail. The forest seemed endless. Every tree looked the same, every shadow felt threatening, and I was hyper-aware of every sound. I moved slowly, scanning constantly, retracing my steps over the difficult terrain I had hiked the day before. I encountered signs of the animal again. A large footprint in the soft mud near the stream, broken branches, patches of flattened grass, but nothing direct. I stayed on high alert, knowing that if it had been tracking me overnight, it could strike at any moment. I also realized I had underestimated the challenge of navigating back to the main trail in the daylight. Every landmark seemed unfamiliar. I had relied on memory alone, and now the forest felt like a maze. By mid-morning, exhaustion began to take over. My muscles ached. My hands were raw from gripping branches and rocks, and I was starting to feel lightheaded. I forced myself to keep moving, telling myself that stopping could be dangerous. Finally, after what felt like hours of careful navigation, I spotted a faint marking on a tree, the same blaze marking I had seen at the trailhead. Relief washed over me in waves. I followed these markers as quickly as I could, the forest gradually opening into a wider path. By early afternoon, I reached the main trailhead. I collapsed beside my car, my body trembling, sweat and dirt caked on my skin, my mind still reeling from the terror of the night. I had survived, but the memory of the darkness, the unseen presence, and the sounds of that night stayed with me in a way that made every forest hike afterward feel different. I drove home slowly, stopping several times to catch my breath, drink water, and collect myself. The experience left me shaken, but it also gave me a sense of clarity. I realized how dangerous true isolation could be, how quickly fear could take over, and how careful one needed to be when venturing into unknown wilderness. I had survived because I stayed alert, avoided rash decisions, and maintained some level of preparedness. But I also knew that luck had played a role, that the night could easily have ended differently. In the days that followed, I took time to recover physically and mentally. I checked my gear for damage, reflected on my decisions, and documented the events of the hike in detail. I wanted to ensure that I understood what had happened, that I could recognize the warning signs in the future, and that I could prepare more thoroughly next time. I realized that the wilderness was beautiful but indifferent, and that the thrill of solitude came with genuine risk. A few weeks later, I returned to the same forest, but this time to the edge of the trail near civilization. I stayed on the main paths, carefully observing the flora and fauna, appreciating the quiet beauty without venturing into the deep, uncharted sections. The fear that had gripped me during that first night remained a distant echo, a reminder of the night I had truly been alone in the wild. I never stopped loving the forest, but I never forgot the lesson it had taught me about respect, awareness, and the razor-thin line between adventure and danger. The night I spent alone in that clearing was the scariest experience of my life, and yet surviving it gave me a confidence and understanding I could never have gained otherwise. I knew the forest could be merciless, but I also knew that careful preparation, calm thinking, and awareness could give someone the upper hand, even against the unknown. That knowledge stayed with me, and every time I stepped into the woods after that, I did so with a careful reverence, fully aware of what it could take and what it could give in return. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea of spending a week alone in the wilderness seemed like the perfect way to escape the noise of the city, the stress at work, and the constant hum of screens and deadlines. I wasn't the type to do casual hikes or weekend camping trips. I wanted something challenging, something that would force me to rely on myself completely. I had mapped out a remote area in the northern mountains, a place where few people went, where trails ended in dense forests and rivers cut deep valleys. I packed carefully, triple-checking my backpack, my water supply, my food, my first aid kit, a sturdy tent, sleeping bag, and emergency gear. I told myself I was ready for anything. The first day went perfectly. The air was crisp, the trees tall and thick, their leaves forming a patchwork canopy above the trail. Birds called intermittently, and the wind rustled through the branches in a way that made the forest feel alive. I kept a steady pace, careful not to exhaust myself, and after hours of walking, I reached a small clearing by a narrow stream. It was perfect for setting up camp. I pitched my tent carefully, choosing a flat area slightly elevated to avoid potential flooding if it rained. I gathered firewood, dry sticks mostly fallen from old trees, and built a small fire. I ate a simple meal from my pack and sat quietly, feeling a rare sense of peace. The sky darkened, and as night settled, the forest became a different world. Shadows stretched and twisted. The sounds of nocturnal creatures rose from the undergrowth, and the stars above shone brilliantly in the clear sky. I went to sleep feeling content, tired from the day's hike but excited for the next. Morning came with an unexpected chill. The temperature had dropped more than I had anticipated, and I realized I hadn't packed enough warm layers. I layered my clothes and ate a quick breakfast before heading deeper into the wilderness. The trail became less defined, marked only by occasional blazes on trees or flattened grass where previous hikers had passed. I reminded myself constantly to stay alert, to pay attention to landmarks, to track my location on my GPS device. I wasn't worried about getting lost, but the solitude made me cautious. Even in the daytime, the forest could be disorienting. Paths could twist and double back without warning, and streams could look deceptively similar. By the third day, the remoteness of the area began to weigh on me. I hadn't seen anyone since leaving the first clearing. The sounds of civilization had vanished entirely. No planes, no distant cars, no faint hum of towns. Just the wind in the trees, the occasional splash of water from a creek, and the soft rustle of leaves as animals moved unseen. I started noticing things I hadn't before. Broken branches that might have been signs of larger animals, footprints partially obscured by soil, the distant howl of wolves that seemed too close for comfort. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that everything I saw had a natural explanation, that the forest was full of creatures just trying to survive like me. But there was something about that isolation that felt oppressive. It was different from being alone in a city apartment or even a normal campsite. Here, no one could hear me. Help wasn't an hour away or even a day away. It could be several days before anyone came through these parts. On the fourth day, I started a new trail along the ridge of a narrow valley. I had marked it on my map, but as I walked, I realized it was more difficult than anticipated. The path was steep and slippery, made worse by recent rain. Rocks and loose soil made every step a potential hazard, and I had to be meticulous about my footing. Around mid-morning, I slipped briefly, catching myself on a root. My adrenaline spiked. I laughed nervously to shake off the tension, but the incident reminded me of the real danger here. One wrong step, one miscalculation, could mean serious injury in a place where no one was around to help. I continued, but my focus became sharper, my senses more attuned to the terrain and the sounds around me. It was late afternoon when I first noticed the movement. At first, it was subtle, just a flicker in my peripheral vision. I froze, staring at the trees, listening. There was a low rustle, then a more pronounced snapping of branches. Something was moving behind the trees, keeping pace with me, or at least appearing to. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was a deer or another animal. But something about the rhythm of the movement felt deliberate, measured. It wasn't random. My heartbeat accelerated. I picked up my pace slightly, careful not to rush in a way that would make me stumble on the uneven ground. The rustling stopped for a moment, then resumed further back, staying just out of sight. I didn't have a weapon beyond my pocket knife, and the idea of confrontation made my stomach twist. I reminded myself not to panic, to keep moving toward my planned campsite for the night, which was still a couple of hours away. As the sun began to dip behind the ridges, the shadows lengthened and deepened. I realized I was far from the place I had planned to camp, and the forest around me was becoming less familiar. I slowed, scanning for any suitable area to set up even a temporary shelter. That's when I saw it, broken branches leading to a small clearing. My instinct screamed at me to stay away, but necessity overrode caution. I stepped into the clearing. It was small, only enough for my tent, and surrounded by trees that would block the wind. I started to set up, constantly glancing over my shoulder. Every sound seemed amplified. The crack of a twig, the distant howl of a coyote, the swish of leaves as something moved just out of sight. My skin felt like it was crawling. I couldn't tell if I was being watched or if it was my imagination magnifying normal forest sounds. I finished setting up the tent just as darkness fully descended. I started a small fire, careful to keep it controlled, and sat close to it, using it as both warmth and a sense of security. I ate a small meal, trying to calm my mind. That's when I noticed the footprints around the clearing. They weren't animal prints, they were human, and they weren't fresh. They were somewhat dry, but the size and depth indicated a large person. My heart pounded. I had assumed this area was completely deserted, yet here was evidence that someone had been here, possibly following the same trail. The realization was chilling. I kept my knife close, tried to stay calm, and told myself that the person was likely long gone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. The night was tense. Every noise made me jump. The wind picked up and the trees groaned. I could hear distant branches snapping as if something large was moving through the forest. I didn't sleep much, only dozing lightly, one hand on my knife, ears straining for anything unusual. By morning, I was exhausted, jittery, and on edge. I decided to break camp quickly and descend to a lower elevation, hoping to find a more familiar trail. As I moved, I kept scanning the surroundings, noticing more signs. Partially buried footprints, disturbed soil, and broken vegetation that suggested recent human activity. It became increasingly clear that someone, or more than one person, was sharing this wilderness with me. They weren't obvious at first, but their presence was unnerving. Over the next 2 days, I had to navigate extremely challenging terrain, constantly aware that I might be being watched. I avoided open spaces as much as possible, stuck to the edges of ridges, and crossed streams quietly. My food supply was running low, and I was starting to feel the strain of constant vigilance. The forest was beautiful, but every step carried a sense of danger I hadn't anticipated. I became hyper-aware of sounds, shadows, even smells, interpreting them all as potential threats. And then it happened. While attempting to cross a steep section with loose rocks, I slipped and fell a short distance down a rocky incline. I wasn't badly hurt, but I bruised my arm and twisted my ankle. Pain shot through me, but worse was the fear of being immobilized out here, alone with no immediate help. I rested, catching my breath, listening intently. I could hear movement in the forest, more consistent this time, as if someone was moving with purpose toward my location. Panic surged. I forced myself to move, slow and steady, stabilizing my ankle as best as I could. By late afternoon on the 5th day, I found a more open area near a river. I realized I needed water desperately and took the opportunity to refill my bottles. As I crouched by the water, I noticed more footprints along the riverbank. Recent, partially wet, human. My mind raced. I wasn't imagining this. Someone had been following me, maybe for days, observing from the trees, waiting. I felt exposed and vulnerable, and the logical part of my mind told me to keep moving and avoid confrontation, but the fight or flight instinct was overwhelming. I decided to push forward along the river, hoping it would lead me to a ranger station or trailhead. I didn't know how far I had to go, only that staying put wasn't an option. The next 2 days were a mixture of exhaustion, fear, and constant vigilance. Every time I stopped to rest, I noticed movement in the distance. A flash of color, a shadow crossing the trail, the sound of footsteps not quite matching my own. I had no way to know if it was one person or multiple. I avoided any terrain that could trap me, sticking to higher ground when possible. I rationed my remaining food, drank carefully from the river, and forced myself to keep moving despite pain and fatigue. My ankle throbbed, my muscles ached, and my mind was constantly on edge. Sleep was nearly impossible, only brief moments of rest while fully alert. The fear wasn't just for my physical safety, but for the psychological toll of being hunted, alone, in the wilderness. Finally, on the 7th day, I stumbled onto a faint trail that was clearly maintained. I recognized it from the map. It led to a ranger outpost. My heart leapt. I followed it cautiously, staying aware of my surroundings, but relief slowly replaced fear. Within an hour, I could see the small structure in the distance, and soon I was at the doorway, knocking loudly. A ranger emerged, shocked to see someone so disheveled, dirty, and exhausted. I explained as best as I could, and they immediately called for backup. While waiting, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I was safe. The ranger confirmed that the area I had been in was rarely visited, and that there had been reports of other hikers encountering unknown individuals who had been following them. They weren't sure of the motives, but they assured me I had gotten out just in time. The aftermath of that experience lingered long after I returned to civilization. I was physically fine after my minor injuries healed, but the psychological impact remained. I couldn't shake the memory of being alone in that forest, the constant sense of being watched, the footprints and broken branches that told me someone had been near me every step of the way. I realized how unprepared I had been for not just the wilderness itself, but for the unpredictability of other humans. Nature could be dangerous, but other people, those who might be hunting or following, were an even greater unknown. I never went back to that area. I still hike and camp, but I take extreme precautions now. I always let people know exactly where I am. I carry tracking devices and communication tools, and I avoid remote areas where no one will pass for days. I learned that even in the most beautiful, serene wilderness, danger can be very real and very close. I survived because I stayed alert, relied on my skills, and kept moving. But the memory of those silent days, of the feeling that I was being watched without ever seeing my watcher, remains vivid, a constant reminder that isolation can be as terrifying as any wild animal. I had been planning this camping trip for months. I wanted to go somewhere remote, away from people, where the forests were dense and the trails were less traveled. I packed my gear carefully: a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold weather, a portable stove, enough food for several days, a first aid kit, and plenty of water. I also packed my backpack with extra layers of clothing, rain gear, a headlamp, a lantern, and a small hatchet. I had maps of the area, a compass, and my phone for emergencies, though I knew I probably wouldn't get any signal out there. I wanted this trip to feel real, unfiltered, raw. I wanted to be completely on my own. The drive to the trailhead took longer than I expected. The forest roads were narrow, twisting, and overgrown in places. I kept glancing at the dense tree line on both sides, feeling a mix of excitement and unease. When I finally reached the trailhead, it was late afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the clearing. A few other campers were packing up their vehicles and leaving. I waved at them and they waved back, and then I was alone. I took a deep breath, slung my backpack over my shoulders, and started walking down the trail. The path was steep in some areas, with loose rocks underfoot and thick roots crisscrossing the ground. I had to step carefully. The forest was quiet in a way that made my skin tingle. Birds were chirping here and there, but there was a stillness that made me aware of every small sound I made. My boots crunching on leaves, twigs snapping under my weight, my own breathing. After a couple of hours of hiking, I reached a small clearing near a stream. The spot seemed perfect for setting up camp. There were flat rocks to sit on, plenty of dry wood scattered nearby, and the stream provided fresh water. I started unpacking, laying out my tent and staking it down firmly. I gathered wood for a fire, picking both dry branches and some larger logs for later. I checked the wind direction and made sure my fire pit would be safe. The sun was dipping lower now, and shadows from the trees stretched long across the ground. I started the fire using a small bundle of kindling and a lighter. It took a few minutes, but soon I had a small flame, and then a roaring fire that warmed the cool evening air. I cooked a simple dinner, some rice and canned beans, and ate slowly, savoring the peace of the forest around me. I cleaned up carefully, making sure to pack away all food scraps and trash. I knew animals could be a danger, especially at night, and I didn't want to attract anything unnecessary. As night fell, the forest became darker and more silent. I sat by the fire for a while, listening to the stream gurgling, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the distant call of an owl. Then I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and laid down on my sleeping pad. The wind picked up, rustling the trees above me, but I felt safe, cocooned in my tent and sleeping bag. Around midnight, I woke to a strange noise. First, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again, a soft, slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being moved across the ground. I froze. My heart started racing. I stayed still, straining my ears. The sound stopped for a moment, then started again, coming closer. I reached for my headlamp and shone it outside the tent. In the circle of light, I saw nothing at first, just the dark shapes of trees and the flickering glow of my dying fire. Then I saw it, a large shape moving just at the edge of the light. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my hatchet and held it close, breathing quietly. The shape moved slowly, deliberately, circling around my campsite. I could see the silhouette of a large animal, probably a bear, though it was hard to be sure in the dim light. I stayed perfectly still, hoping it wouldn't notice me. The bear sniffed around the fire pit, pawing at the ground. My fire was small now, mostly smoldering embers, but I kept it burning slightly, tossing small sticks onto it to keep the glow. The bear stayed close to the edge of the light, sniffing the air. I knew bears were often curious, especially if they smelled food. I had packed all my food in a bear-proof bag, hanging it from a tree, but the smell of dinner probably lingered. The bear moved slowly around the campsite, then started walking away, rustling through the bushes. I waited, heart pounding, until I couldn't hear anything anymore. My adrenaline was high, and I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep just yet. I stayed awake, sitting by the fire, listening to every sound. Occasionally, I thought I saw movement in the shadows, but it was probably just my eyes playing tricks in the dark. Morning came, cold and gray, with mist rising from the stream. I was exhausted from the night scare, but I knew I couldn't just sit there. I packed up some of my things and carefully walked around the campsite, checking for any signs of the bear. There were paw prints in the soft soil near the fire pit. They were huge, and I studied them for a while, making sure the bear hadn't come back during the night. It hadn't. I let out a small sigh of relief. I decided to hike further into the forest that morning, hoping to find a safer spot to spend the rest of the trip. I kept my hatchet in hand and my backpack secure. The forest was thick, with ferns and fallen branches making the trail hard to follow in places. I had to climb over fallen logs, duck under low branches, and sometimes backtrack when the trail disappeared under brush. It was physically exhausting, but I kept going, careful to watch for wildlife. By mid-afternoon, I found another clearing. This one was smaller, but it had a higher vantage point. From there, I could see a small valley below and a distant ridge. I decided this would be my new campsite. I set up the tent, gathered firewood, and built a small fire again. I cooked another meal, this time making sure all scraps were packed away immediately. I hung my food from a tree branch far from the tent, using a rope to ensure the bear or any other animal couldn't reach it. That night, I slept lightly. I kept the tent zipped and my hatchet within reach. The sounds of the forest seemed louder here, the hoot of owls, the rustle of small animals, the wind shaking the branches. I could hear water flowing somewhere below, probably a stream hidden by the trees. I didn't hear the bear that night, but I stayed alert anyway. The next morning, I woke early to the cold and damp air. My plan was to pack up and head back to my car by the end of the day. I wanted to avoid another night in the forest alone. I ate a quick breakfast, packed the tent, and checked my gear. The trail down was steep and slippery in places, with loose soil and moss-covered rocks. I had to move carefully, keeping my balance. Halfway down, I slipped on a mossy rock and twisted my ankle. Pain shot up my leg, and I stumbled, clutching a tree to keep from falling. I sat down for a moment, trying to calm the pain. My ankle was swollen, but I could still put some weight on it. I decided to move slowly and carefully, hopping lightly on my good leg and taking small steps with the injured one. The hike became grueling. Every step was a challenge, and I had to stop often to rest and reduce swelling. Hours passed. The forest seemed endless, and my water supply was running low. I rationed what I had left. I could hear the distant sound of cars at times, which gave me hope, but the noise was always faint, swallowed by the trees. My muscles ached, my ankle throbbed, and I felt a growing sense of urgency. I couldn't stay in the forest overnight with an injury like this. Finally, as the sun was starting to set, I saw the clearing where the trailhead was. My heart lifted. I pushed myself forward, limping badly, sweat and dirt covering my clothes and face. I reached the parking area just as the light faded. A few cars were still there, and the last campers were packing up. I waved at them weakly, grateful for human presence, and they waved back. I felt an overwhelming sense of relief and accomplishment. I hobbled to my car, loaded my backpack and gear, and started the engine. The drive home was slow because I had to keep my ankle elevated, but I didn't care. I was leaving the forest safely. When I finally reached home, I cleaned myself up, tended to my ankle properly, and reflected on the experience. It had been frightening, exhausting, and physically demanding, but I had managed every challenge. I had survived on my own, and that gave me a strange, hard-earned sense of pride. Over the next few days, I rested, iced my ankle, and slowly regained my strength. I thought about the forest constantly, the quiet, the danger, the beauty, and the isolation. I realized that camping alone in a remote area was not just about enjoying nature, but about learning to be prepared, patient, and cautious. I had faced real fear and I had overcome it. From that trip, I learned to respect the forest in a way I never had before. I understood the importance of preparation, vigilance, and careful planning. I realized that being alone in the wilderness was both a test and a teacher. I knew I would return one day, better prepared and more experienced, but I would never forget the tension, the fear, and the relief of surviving that trip. That experience changed how I approached the outdoors and life in general. I felt stronger, wiser, and more capable, and I carried that sense of resilience with me every day after. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. I had mapped out a route deep in the mountains, far from roads, far from cell signal, a place that promised silence and the chance to be alone with the woods. I was carrying everything I thought I might need: a heavy pack with food for a week, a water filter, a small but sturdy tent, sleeping bag, first aid kit, and a few tools I wasn't sure I would use but carried anyway. I had done smaller trips before, nothing dangerous, but nothing this remote. I wanted the challenge and the isolation. The first day was easy. The trail started at a small parking area, crowded with families and hikers. But as soon as I turned onto the narrower forest path, the noise and people disappeared. The air felt fresher here, cooler, and heavier with the smell of pine and earth. Sunlight filtered through the dense branches, casting sharp shadows on the ground. I walked for hours, feeling the rhythm of my steps and breathing in the silence. Occasionally, I would hear the faint rustle of small animals or the distant call of birds, but mostly, there was just me, my footsteps, and the wind moving through the trees. I set up my first camp at a small clearing beside a creek. The ground was soft but firm enough for the tent. I had chosen this spot because it had water nearby, a relatively flat area for sleeping, and a good view of the surrounding forest. I arranged my gear carefully, making sure nothing was left loose. I cooked my first meal over a small camp stove, enjoying the warmth and the quiet. At night, I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the stars through the thin mesh of my tent, and felt a strange mix of peace and unease. Being so far from anyone else brought a weight of responsibility. If anything went wrong, there was no one to help. The next day, I decided to push deeper into the forest. My map showed a ridge about 3 miles ahead that promised a good lookout point. The terrain grew steeper and rockier, and I had to scramble over fallen trees and navigate narrow paths along steep slopes. I had been careful with my footing, but fatigue was beginning to build. By the time I reached the ridge, my legs were trembling, my back sore from the pack, but the view was worth it. I could see the forest stretching for miles, a patchwork of green and brown with the river cutting through like a silver ribbon. I decided to make camp near the ridge that night, though there was no flat ground exactly where I wanted. I found a small depression with enough room for my tent. I anchored it carefully, aware that the slope made stability a concern. I ate a light meal, drank plenty of water, and tried to settle in for sleep. Around midnight, the wind picked up, whistling through the trees, making my tent flap loudly. I lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the forest. Sometimes it was the wind, sometimes the crack of a branch falling, and sometimes a rustle too deliberate to be random. My mind raced through possibilities. A deer, a bear, or worse, another person. I tried to remind myself of the odds, but unease gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. By morning, I was exhausted. I packed up quickly, ate a small breakfast, and headed down the ridge, aiming for a gentler slope that led to a stream my map marked as a camping area. The descent was tricky. Loose gravel and wet moss made every step dangerous, and I had to stop several times to rest. My legs ached, and a small bruise was forming on my knee from a slip I barely prevented. I told myself I was being careful, that the discomfort was part of the experience, but I also noticed a creeping anxiety I couldn't shake. The stream was a relief. The sound of running water was soothing, and the clearing nearby offered space for a proper camp. I spent the afternoon fishing, though I didn't catch anything, and gathering wood for a fire. The light was fading by the time I had everything set up, and I sat beside the fire, letting the heat warm my chilled hands. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that makes you feel both safe and exposed at the same time. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound that immediately made my stomach drop. It wasn't the wind or a falling branch or the movement of small animals. It was heavier, deliberate footsteps approaching my tent. My first thought was a bear, but the rhythm and softness of the steps didn't match anything I had read about wild animals. They were careful, cautious, but definitely coming closer. My heart raced. I had my knife in hand and kept perfectly still, listening. The sound circled the tent, pausing now and then, almost as if whoever or whatever it was assessing me. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, though it was probably minutes. Eventually, the footsteps retreated, leaving only the occasional rustle in the underbrush. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept my fire small but steady, knowing it offered both warmth and a small sense of security. The next day, I decided to break camp early. I had a feeling of urgency, a sense that staying put was riskier than moving. I packed as efficiently as I could, double-checking that everything was secure, and started following the trail marked on my map toward a ranger station several miles downriver. The path was mostly downhill, but the terrain was rough with fallen logs, slick rocks, and thick undergrowth. My anxiety didn't lessen, though I tried to focus on the task at hand, putting one foot in front of the other, following the path, and reaching safety. By mid-afternoon, I spotted a small abandoned cabin near the trail. It was dilapidated, but it offered shelter from the wind and sun. I approached cautiously, looking around for signs of danger, and stepped inside. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the air smelled of damp wood and rot. I spent some time inspecting it, clearing space to rest, and finally allowed myself a moment to sit down. My muscles screamed from fatigue, and I could feel my body beginning to shut down. As evening approached, the light dimmed quickly. I set a small fire in the metal stove I had brought and cooked a modest meal. I kept my knife close and my pack within reach, aware that the forest could hide threats at any time. Night fell, deep and complete, and the shadows around the cabin thickened. I was alone, isolated, with only the fire and my thoughts. The wind moaned through broken windows, and small animals scratched outside. I listened, trying to separate natural sounds from possible danger, but the effort exhausted me further. Around midnight, I heard movement outside again. Footsteps, deliberate and slow, circling the cabin. My heart pounded, and I gripped my knife tightly. I didn't make a sound, didn't move, just waited. The sounds stopped after a long while, but my body refused to relax. I spent the night in a state of tense vigilance, half sleeping, listening to every small noise. By morning, I knew I had to leave immediately. I packed quickly, deciding that the cabin, however protective it seemed, had become a trap in my mind. I followed the trail, careful to make no unnecessary noise, and kept scanning my surroundings. Hours passed in this tense rhythm, my eyes constantly moving, my ears alert for any sound out of place. I stopped only to drink water and eat small snacks, conserving energy for what felt like a survival trek. Mid-afternoon, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt trail. They were not deep, but they were recent. My immediate thought was someone else had been in the area overnight, and possibly they had been following me. Panic surged, but I forced myself to slow down and think. I knew the only way to ensure safety was to reach a populated area. The ranger station marked on my map was still miles away, but it was the only choice. I increased my pace, carefully navigating tricky parts of the trail. As the sun began to set, I finally reached the small ranger station. It was more of a checkpoint than a full station, with a single building and a cleared area. A ranger was there, surprised to see me so late in the day. I explained quickly, skipping no details of my trek, my fears, the strange sounds, the footsteps in the night, the tire tracks. The ranger listened carefully, nodded, and immediately called for backup. They reassured me that I was safe now and that the forest had been patrolled more thoroughly after my report. I felt a weight lift off my chest I hadn't realized I had been carrying. The following days were less tense but still exhausting. I stayed at the ranger station until they arranged for a vehicle to take me back to the nearest town. I couldn't sleep without the sound of human voices or the presence of people nearby. I felt relief I hadn't experienced since the start of the trip. Once in town, I took a long shower, ate proper meals, and slept for hours in a real bed. It was strange to be back in civilization, surrounded by lights and the constant hum of life. Looking back, the trip had been both terrifying and eye-opening. I had underestimated how vulnerable a person could feel in the wilderness when completely alone and aware that there was no immediate help if something went wrong. But I also realized the importance of preparation, the value of awareness, and the need to respect the forest, not as a mystical or magical place, but as a real environment where danger comes from both nature and human unpredictability. I never returned to that remote area again, but the experience changed me, made me more cautious, more respectful, and more grateful for safety and companionship. I had been planning this camping trip for months. I wanted to be completely alone in the wilderness, away from people, cell signals, and the constant noise of the city. I had read about a remote area in the mountains that was supposed to be quiet, wild, and challenging. The thought of pitching my tent near a river, under tall pines, surrounded by nothing but nature, was both exhilarating and intimidating. I spent weeks preparing. I bought a new tent, a sleeping bag rated for low temperatures, a portable stove, and a bear-proof food container. I packed extra water, protein bars, and all the necessary survival gear, including a first aid kit and a map. I was determined to be ready for anything. The drive up the mountain was long and tiring. The road narrowed quickly as I got closer to my destination, turning into a rough dirt path full of rocks and loose gravel. The forest seemed to close in on me as I drove, the sunlight filtering through the dense trees, leaving dappled shadows on the ground. By the time I parked my car near a small trailhead, the sky was already tinged with orange from the late afternoon sun. I loaded my backpack, double-checked my gear, and started hiking. The first few miles were easy. The trail was clear, and the air smelled like pine and wet soil. Birds chirped occasionally, and the distant sound of a river accompanied me for some time. I had a clear plan in my mind: hike until I found a good spot near the river to set up camp before nightfall. I wanted to make sure I had enough daylight to pitch the tent, gather firewood, and set up my cooking area. The forest was beautiful, calming even, but as I walked, I kept noticing small details that made me feel uneasy. Twisted branches, animal tracks that seemed too fresh, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush that didn't match the sound of normal wildlife. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, probably just deer or squirrels, but I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't entirely alone. After about 3 hours of hiking, I found a clearing next to the river. The water flowed swiftly, glinting in the fading sunlight. The ground was relatively flat, and there were enough fallen branches to make a decent fire. I set down my pack and started unpacking. Pitching the tent took longer than I expected, but eventually, it was up and secured. I stacked wood for the fire and started preparing dinner on my portable stove. The sun dipped below the horizon, and shadows stretched across the forest. The air grew colder, and I zipped up my jacket tightly, feeling a small thrill of isolation. This was exactly what I had wanted: quiet, solitude, and the wildness of nature surrounding me. Night fell completely. The forest was no longer a friendly place of trees and birds. It was dark, shadowy, and full of unknown sounds. I lit the fire, sitting close to it for warmth and comfort, listening to the river's constant rush. I ate a simple meal of dehydrated food and water, trying to enjoy the solitude, but my mind kept wandering. Every snap of a twig, every distant howl or rustle made my heart beat faster. I reminded myself to stay calm. This was part of camping, part of being alone in the wilderness. I was prepared. Around midnight, after extinguishing the stove, I crawled into my tent and zipped it closed. The forest outside was alive with sounds. The distant calls of nocturnal animals, the wind moving through the trees, and the river flowing nearby. I tried to sleep, but it was difficult. Every sound seemed louder inside the tent. After a few hours of tossing and turning, I eventually drifted off. I awoke suddenly to a sound that didn't belong. It was a low, scraping noise outside my tent, slow and deliberate. My heart raced and I froze. I listened carefully, trying to identify it. Came again, closer this time, moving along the perimeter of my camp. The sound wasn't a deer, and it wasn't a small animal like a raccoon. It was too heavy, deliberate, and cautious. I realized then that it might be a bear, or something similar. My mind raced through the options. I hadn't seen any bears earlier, but the mountain was full of wildlife. I could hear heavy breathing, and the ground seemed to shake slightly with each step. I reached for my flashlight and shined it toward the sound. For a moment, nothing. Then, a dark shape moved across the clearing, big and shadowy, too large to be a deer. I froze, trying to stay calm. I remembered what I had read about bear safety. Don't run, make yourself visible, make noise. I picked up a large stick from inside my tent, gripping it tightly. The sound continued, moving closer, circling the camp slowly. My stomach churned. I realized I had left some food outside, thinking it was too heavy to bring inside the tent. That was a mistake. I had unknowingly attracted attention. I stayed perfectly still, trying not to make a sound. The creature sniffed around, scraping the ground, occasionally bumping into a tree. I could hear it breathing heavily. Every few seconds, it would let out a low grunt, and I knew it was testing the area. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. I thought about my options. Stay in the tent and hope it left, or try to scare it off. I remembered that yelling and making noise could work, but I was terrified. Finally, I decided to take a small action. I grabbed a can of food, shook it violently to make a loud noise, and banged it on a rock outside the tent. The sound echoed through the forest. There was a pause, then a startled grunt, followed by heavy footsteps retreating. My heart pounded as I waited, holding my breath, listening to ensure it had left. Eventually, the noises faded into the distance. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, staying alert, eyes and ears scanning every shadow. Morning came slowly. I felt exhausted, tense, and jittery. The sun barely made it through the trees, and I took time to assess the situation. Some of my supplies were disturbed. Small dents in the ground suggested the bear, or whatever it was, had been rooting around. I realized that camping in complete isolation in bear territory was far riskier than I had imagined. I decided I would pack up and leave as soon as possible. The sense of adventure I had felt yesterday was gone, replaced by caution and awareness. I carefully packed everything, keeping food secured in containers and not leaving anything outside. As I hiked back toward the car, I stayed alert. Every shadow, every rustle made me tense. I moved quickly but carefully, following the trail I had come on. The hike took longer than expected. I kept my eyes open for animal tracks, signs of other wildlife, and anything unusual. Around midday, I heard distant shouting. Initially, I thought it might be hikers or campers, but the sounds were closer now. Relief flooded me as I realized there were people nearby. I followed the sounds until I found a small group on a nearby trail. They gave me directions back to the main road, and I hurried along, grateful for human presence. When I reached my car, I sat inside for a long time, breathing deeply, still shaken. The trip had given me exactly what I wanted, solitude, and connection with nature, but it also reminded me how unprepared anyone could be if they didn't respect wildlife and the isolation of the wilderness. I drove back slowly, taking the safe, maintained roads, thinking about what had happened. I felt a strange combination of relief and satisfaction. I had faced fear, stayed calm, and survived the night. I realized that respect for the environment, preparation, and caution were not just guidelines, they were life-saving. Over the next few days, I processed the experience. I learned from it. I wrote detailed notes about the location, my mistakes, and what I would do differently. I realized that fear in the wilderness was normal and necessary. It kept me alert, kept me alive. I made a plan to return to the mountains someday, but not alone, and with more precautions. I wanted to experience nature, but I would never underestimate it again. The night in the tent, the close encounter with the bear, and the tension of isolation had left a mark. It wasn't a story of heroism or adventure. It was a story of survival, awareness, and respect. That trip taught me more about the wild and about myself than I had ever expected. I had always liked camping. I liked being out in the woods, away from people, away from the noise and constant movement of the city. There was a strange comfort in being surrounded by trees, hearing nothing but the wind and the birds and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I had gone on dozens of camping trips before, most of them solo, some with friends, and I thought I had seen it all. But that summer, in a forest I had never visited before, I learned that being alone in the wilderness could be far more dangerous and terrifying than anything I had imagined. And it wasn't because of anything supernatural. It was entirely, terrifyingly real. I had been planning the trip for months. I had chosen a remote area several hours' drive from the nearest town, a place that wasn't well known, where few people went. I wanted complete solitude, and I got exactly that. I packed my car the night before, checking and double-checking my gear. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, first aid kit, flashlight, extra batteries, map, compass, and a small survival knife. I was confident in my preparation. I had done long hikes before, I knew how to navigate, and I had experience in survival situations. Or so I thought. I arrived at the trailhead late in the morning, the sun high in the sky. The air smelled clean and earthy, heavy with the scent of pine and wet soil from the morning dew. The parking lot was empty except for one rusty old van that looked like it had been there for months. I didn't think much of it and started hiking along the narrow dirt trail that led into the forest. The trail was lined with tall trees, mostly pines and oaks, their trunks dark and rough. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating patterns of gold and green on the forest floor. The air was warm but not hot, with a slight breeze that rustled the leaves. Birds chirped in the distance, and I felt a calm sense of anticipation. I had my backpack on, my boots laced tight, and I felt ready for whatever the wilderness might throw at me. The hike started easy. The trail was well marked at first, though narrow and winding. I walked slowly, taking in my surroundings, noting the sounds and smells of the forest. There were occasional small clearings, patches where the sun hit the ground directly, making the air feel warmer. I drank water from my bottle and kept moving, telling myself that I would find a good campsite by late afternoon. I had planned to hike about 10 miles that day before setting up camp. It wasn't a difficult trail, but it was long enough to give me a sense of accomplishment. I liked hiking alone. There was a rhythm to the steps, the breathing, the quiet that felt like a kind of meditation. By early afternoon, I had hiked over 6 miles. I found a small clearing near a shallow stream. The stream wasn't more than a few feet across, its water clear and cold, running over smooth stones and fallen leaves. I thought this would be a perfect spot to set up camp. The ground was mostly flat, with some patches of dry dirt and pine needles. There were no obvious hazards, though I noted some bear tracks nearby. They were old, though, and I wasn't particularly worried. I set down my pack, took off my boots, and stretched. I checked the map to make sure I knew my position and decided to set up my tent a few yards from the stream, far enough to avoid moisture but close enough for water access. The sun was still high, and I wanted to have everything ready before it got dark. Setting up the tent was easy. I laid out the ground sheet, put up the poles, and anchored it with stakes. I arranged my sleeping bag inside and stacked my backpack in a corner. I then took out my small stove and started boiling water for a simple meal. While the water heated, I explored the immediate area around the clearing. The forest was dense in some parts, with thick underbrush and fallen logs. In other areas, it opened up to small clearings where sunlight poured down. I noticed that the birds and small animals were starting to quiet as the afternoon wore on. It was an odd shift. The forest seemed almost aware that something was changing. I shook the thought from my mind and focused on cooking. I had pasta and some canned sauce, simple and filling. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet and the warm meal. By the time I finished, the sun was beginning to lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. I cleaned up my cooking area carefully, storing my food in a bear-proof container and making sure no scraps were left behind. I had learned early on that animals could smell food from far away, and I didn't want to attract anything unnecessarily. Afterward, I decided to take a short walk along the stream, just a few hundred yards upstream, to stretch my legs and explore. The water ran over rocks and small waterfalls, creating a soft, soothing noise. The forest was peaceful, almost serene, but I noticed something that made the hairs on my neck stand up. The tracks I had seen earlier, the ones I assumed were old, were fresh here. Large prints in the soft mud, far bigger than mine, leading parallel to the stream. I paused and examined them closely. They weren't deer or any small animal. These were unmistakably human. Big human footprints, barefoot, pressed deep into the wet mud. I froze, looking around, but I didn't see anyone. My heart rate increased slightly. I reminded myself that hikers and campers sometimes pass through, that it wasn't unusual. Still, there was something unsettling about the isolation of this place. I took out my knife, just in case, and headed back to my tent, trying to stay calm. By the time I returned, the sun was dipping below the treeline. The forest was changing again. Shadows grew long and dark, the air cooled, and the sounds of birds were replaced by the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of twigs under unseen feet. I lit a small lantern and secured it near the tent entrance. I knew I needed to sleep early to rest for the hike the next day, but as darkness settled in, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. I double-checked my gear, making sure everything was in reach. My knife, my flashlight, extra batteries, water, and a small hatchet were all placed near me. I listened. For a long time, I heard nothing but the gentle flow of the stream and the wind through the trees. Then I heard it. A faint snapping of twigs, not from the trail, not from where I had walked, but from deeper in the woods. Slow, deliberate, as if someone or something was moving carefully toward me. I held my breath, straining to see through the darkness. The lantern light didn't reach far, and the shadows seemed to twist and move with the wind. I tried to convince myself it was a deer or some small animal, but the steps were too heavy, too purposeful. I spent the next hour sitting in my tent, listening. The sounds moved closer and then stopped, as if circling me. Every now and then, there was a rustle in the underbrush, and I could swear I glimpsed a dark shape moving between the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, holding my knife, listening to the forest, feeling my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I rationed my movements, trying not to make a sound. My mind raced with scenarios, none of them good. By dawn, I was exhausted, pale, and shaking slightly. The forest looked different in daylight. The shadows were gone, but the tracks remained. I checked the prints again. They hadn't gone anywhere. In fact, there were more now, circling around the clearing, showing that someone, or more than one person, had been moving around me while I slept. My stomach turned. This was no ordinary camper. This was someone watching me. I knew then that my isolation had made me a target. I couldn't stay. I packed up quickly, keeping my movements quiet but fast. I left nothing behind that could slow me down, storing my food in the pack and taking everything essential. The tracks seemed to follow me as I moved along the trail. I kept glancing over my shoulder, trying to see through the trees, trying to spot any sign of whoever had been circling me. I walked fast but carefully, knowing that the forest could hide anyone. The adrenaline kept me going. I wasn't lost. I had my map and compass, but I also knew that being pursued in a forest this dense was dangerous. Any wrong move, any stumble could give whoever or whatever was following me an advantage. Hours passed. The sun rose higher, and I forced myself to keep moving despite exhaustion. I changed my route slightly, taking less obvious trails, crossing streams, and avoiding the wider path. My mind was in a constant state of alert. Every sound, every shadow, every movement made my pulse spike. I realized that whoever had been circling my camp was likely still around, watching, waiting for me to let my guard down. I thought about my options. Keep moving, try to reach the road, and if necessary, defend myself. I had my knife, but I knew I couldn't take on a determined human threat alone in the woods. By late afternoon, I finally reached a ridge that gave me a partial view of the surrounding area. In the distance, I could see a road winding through the forest. Relief washed over me. I wasn't out of danger, but I could reach help soon. I increased my pace, moving downhill carefully but quickly. My legs burned, my back ached, and my boots were soaked, but I didn't care. Every step brought me closer to safety. As I neared the road, I spotted movement. A figure was standing near the edge of the tree line, watching me. I froze. It was a man, tall, thin, wearing dark clothing. He didn't move as I approached, just observed. My heart sank. He hadn't left. He had been following me, tracking me. I considered running the last few hundred yards to the road, but I knew he could catch me before I reached it. I gripped my knife tightly and kept walking slowly, deliberately, making sure to keep my eyes on him. Then, something unexpected happened. He turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing from view. I didn't wait to see if he came back. I ran the last distance to the road, collapsing onto the gravel shoulder. Cars passed by, and eventually one stopped. I flagged it down, explained as best I could, and the driver called the authorities. They escorted me back to safety. Later, the police investigated the area. There were signs of someone else camping near my spot, but the person had left, probably after realizing I had survived the night. They never found him, but the tracks and signs confirmed that I had not imagined any of it. I returned home shaken, but alive. The forest had been beautiful, serene, and terrifying all at once. I realized then that camping alone in remote areas could expose you to dangers that were entirely human, entirely real, and far worse than anything supernatural. I learned to respect the forest not just for its beauty, but for the unpredictability of the real threats that could hide within it. I never went back to that trail, and I never camped alone in such isolation again. Even now, years later, I remember the sound of those footsteps circling my tent, the shadows moving in the night, the feeling of being watched and alone. I remember the adrenaline, the fear, and the relief when I finally reached the road. It is a memory that has stayed with me, a reminder that nature is not always peaceful, and that sometimes the scariest things in the forest are not animals or storms. They are other humans. I had always loved the quiet of the woods, the kind of quiet that presses in on you from all sides, a stillness broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. It was early September when I decided to take a solo camping trip to a section of forest I had never explored before. The area was far from the nearest town, deep in the national forest, a place where cell service barely existed and the roads ended in a rough dirt track. I packed my backpack carefully, making sure I had everything I might need. A tent, sleeping bag, food for 4 days, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a map, and a compass. I also carried a small folding saw and a hatchet, thinking they could be useful if I needed to clear firewood or navigate through thick underbrush. I told myself I was being thorough, that I wasn't taking any chances. The drive to the trailhead was long and tiring. The sun was already beginning to lower in the sky by the time I parked my car at the small dirt lot at the start of the trail. The area was quiet, almost too quiet. The usual sounds of traffic and distant voices were absent. replaced by the steady wind moving through the treetops and the soft crunch of fallen leaves under my boots as I started hiking. The trail was narrow, covered in leaves and small branches. I had seen some hikers along this path before in other parts of the forest, but today I was alone. The solitude felt peaceful at first, comforting even, until I noticed something slightly off. About an hour into my hike, I saw footprints in the soft dirt along the trail. They looked fresh, but I couldn't tell what made them. The tracks were irregular, not in a straight line. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a large dog, but the prints were too large and deep for a deer. A sense of unease crept over me. I glanced around the trees, half expecting to see someone watching, but there was nothing, just shadows and the faint shifting of leaves in the wind. I shook off the feeling and continued walking, telling myself I was being paranoid. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing beside a stream, a perfect spot for my first night. I set up my tent carefully, hammering the stakes into the ground, making sure it was secure. I collected some dry wood and kindling for a fire, arranging it neatly beside a small stone ring I had built to contain the flames. The sun was dipping lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The forest around me seemed to darken faster than usual, shadows stretching and shifting unnaturally with the fading light. I lit the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the occasional snap of a burning branch. As darkness fell, I felt that familiar mixture of peace and isolation that came with camping alone. I ate a simple dinner of canned beans and bread, washing it down with water from my bottle. I had filtered the water from the stream earlier, using a small portable filter I always carried. The night settled in completely, and the forest became almost completely silent except for the gentle murmur of the stream. I lay down in my sleeping bag inside the tent, listening to the soft rustling outside. It wasn't unusual to hear animals moving in the night, but this time, there was something different. A deliberate, rhythmic crunching sound that came from somewhere beyond the clearing. It wasn't constant, but it was close enough that I couldn't ignore it. I stayed still, straining to hear. Each step, each crack of a twig, seemed unnervingly deliberate. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't moving like an animal. It felt human. My mind raced. I had read about hikers encountering hunters, and occasionally other people who weren't always friendly. But this deep into the forest, the thought of someone else being nearby was unsettling. I unzipped the tent slightly and peeked out, my flashlight ready, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. There was nothing, just trees and shadows. I told myself to calm down and that it was probably an animal. Maybe a raccoon or a deer, though the weight of the steps didn't fit. Sleep came in fits. I kept waking up, startled by the smallest noises. The rustle of leaves, a branch snapping, or the distant calls of nocturnal birds. Every time I woke, I checked my surroundings, convinced I had seen a shadow moving outside. By the second night, the feeling of being watched was almost unbearable. The footprints I had seen earlier were still on my mind. I kept imagining shapes moving just beyond the firelight, just out of reach of my vision. I didn't bring a gun, only my pocket knife and the hatchet. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I was stubborn, telling myself I could handle a night alone in the woods. On the third day, I decided to explore a little farther, hiking upstream along the creek. The trail became rougher, less traveled, and more overgrown. I had to duck under branches and carefully step over exposed roots and slippery rocks. At one point, I noticed another set of footprints in the soft earth beside the stream. They weren't the same as the first ones I saw. They were smaller, lighter, but unmistakably human. I felt a jolt of fear. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized I wasn't alone in this forest. I had been telling myself for days that it was just me and the wildlife, but this evidence contradicted that entirely. I didn't see anyone, and I wanted to leave immediately, but the thought of retracing my steps along the difficult trail made me pause. I decided to continue upstream, keeping my eyes open for signs of people or shelters. The forest grew denser. The trees were close together, the canopy thick, making it dark even in the middle of the day. I noticed markings on some of the tree trunks, scratches that looked like they could have been made with a knife or an axe. The thought of someone else camping or hunting in the area was unnerving. I checked my watch. I had enough daylight to go back, but the trail was narrow and the underbrush thick. I pressed on, feeling the tension build with each step. As evening approached, I realized I had wandered farther than I intended. The stream curved, and the trail disappeared completely, replaced by dense undergrowth. I knew I had to set up camp somewhere. I found a small patch of relatively flat ground just off the stream. There was no fire pit here, no safe clearings, only the forest pressing in from all sides. I set up the tent as best as I could, knowing that this night would be difficult. That night, the noises were louder, closer. The crunching steps returned, circling the small clearing where I had pitched my tent. I didn't dare peek outside. My imagination ran wild with possibilities. Hunters, trespassers, maybe someone lost like me or worse. I kept my flashlight within reach, as well as my hatchet, and I sat upright in my sleeping bag, listening to the approaching and retreating sounds. The hours dragged on. At some point, the footsteps stopped. I assumed whoever it was had moved on, though I couldn't be sure. Morning brought a little relief. The sunlight filtered through the trees, illuminating the forest in a soft, almost comforting light. I packed up quickly, keeping my senses alert. I returned to the main trail as fast as I could, using my compass and map to guide me. The forest still felt alive with movement, though mostly animals this time, the occasional squirrel or bird reminding me of the ordinary. By late afternoon, I reached my car, exhausted but relieved. On the drive back to town, I kept replaying the events in my head. The fear hadn't left me, and I realized that the forest was far more dangerous than I had allowed myself to admit. I told myself I had been lucky that the people, or whatever, who had been nearby never made themselves known directly. I also resolved to be more cautious in the future, to avoid isolated areas without letting someone know exactly where I would be, to carry more protection, and to trust my instincts if something felt wrong. The experience haunted me for weeks. I couldn't shake the sense of being watched, the echo of footsteps in the dirt, or the scratches on the trees. But over time, I learned from it. I became more careful with my planning and more aware of my surroundings. I returned to camping, but only in areas that were either more populated or better mapped, always leaving detailed plans with friends. What had been a terrifying experience became a lesson in respect for the forest and its unknown dangers, and I never underestimated that silence, that feeling of being alone, again. Eventually, I realized that the fear had changed me in a positive way. I became more prepared, more observant, and more cautious without losing my love for the woods. It wasn't the supernatural that had made that trip scary. It was the very real danger of isolation, the unknown presence of other people, and the forest itself. And in learning to survive that encounter, I came to appreciate the delicate balance of enjoying nature while respecting its power. I had survived, and that clarity brought a quiet sense of accomplishment that no thrill or fantasy could ever replicate. I had been planning the camping trip for months, and finally, the weekend arrived. I wanted to get away from everything: work, city noise, the constant pressure of life. I packed my car with all the essentials: a sturdy tent, sleeping bag, cooking gear, enough food for a few days, water bottles, and my backpack with extra layers, a first aid kit, and some tools just in case. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going. I had chosen a small, lesser-known area in the mountains, somewhere that didn't see many hikers. The idea of being alone in the wilderness excited me, but I also knew it carried real risks. I wasn't naive. I had done some hiking before and understood the dangers, at least in theory. The drive up was long and winding. As I left the main roads behind, the pavement ended, replaced by a rough dirt trail that bounced the car around. The mountains rose steeply on either side, thick forests covering most of the slopes. The air felt cleaner here, cooler, almost sharp, carrying the scent of pine and damp soil. I had stopped a few times along the way to take pictures, but I was careful not to linger too long. I wanted to reach my campsite before dark. I finally found a clearing beside a small stream. It wasn't an official campsite. There were no marked spots, no fire pits, no other people. Just a flat area with grass, some scattered rocks, and the gentle sound of water trickling over stones. Perfect. I parked the car, unloaded my gear, and started setting up the tent. I chose a spot a little higher than the stream in case of sudden rain, making sure the ground was level. I hammered in the tent stakes, tested the poles, and secured everything tightly. The sun was starting to sink, painting the sky with orange and pink streaks, and I knew I had only a short window to get a fire going before night fell completely. I gathered wood from the forest edge, selecting dry branches and smaller twigs to start a fire. I found a large flat stone to place in the center as a makeshift hearth, then built a small pile of kindling and branches. I had packed matches and a lighter, so starting the fire wasn't difficult, but I made sure to build it carefully. Once the flames took hold, I felt a surge of satisfaction. The fire was warm and comforting, the smoke mingling with the scent of the forest. I cooked a simple dinner over it, a can of beans heated in a pot and some bread. It wasn't gourmet, but it was filling. Night came fast. The forest became a dark wall around me, the stream barely visible in the dim light of the fire. I put on an extra layer, zipped myself into the sleeping bag, and lay back on my foam pad, looking up at the stars. The sky was clearer than I had seen in years. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a ribbon of light. For a while, everything felt perfect, peaceful, safe. But safety is a fragile illusion in the wild. I had learned this before, but nothing quite prepares you for the feeling of being truly alone. Around midnight, I woke to a rustling sound. My heart jumped. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving branches or small animals scurrying through the underbrush. But then I realized the sound was closer, heavier. Something large was moving through the trees, deliberately, not randomly. My pulse quickened. I reached for my flashlight, careful not to make sudden movements. I shone the beam toward the sound. The light caught on a figure, large, hunched, moving along the edge of the clearing. My first thought was a bear. The area was known for black bears, and though they usually avoid humans, they could be dangerous if surprised or hungry. I froze, trying to appear calm. The creature didn't run away, and I realized with a chill that it wasn't moving like a bear normally would. It seemed almost aware of me. My mind raced with options. Should I stay in the tent or try to scare it off? Every instinct screamed to stay calm and not provoke it. I remembered the advice from past hikes. Make yourself big, make noise, and slowly back away. But I was trapped in the clearing. There was no higher ground nearby, only dense forest. The creature stayed just on the edge of the trees, circling the clearing. I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot, the occasional snap of a branch. My fire was my only source of comfort, but I knew it wouldn't stop anything if this was a determined predator. I grabbed a long stick from the ground, holding it like a spear, and stood slowly. The firelight danced across the trees, throwing shadows. For a long time, nothing happened. Then the rustling stopped. Silence. My breathing was loud in my ears. I strained my eyes, trying to see beyond the edge of the clearing. Suddenly, the noise returned, this time closer. I could see movement in the shadows, a large animal, maybe even more than one. My stomach dropped. I had to make a decision. Stay in the tent and hope it leaves, or try to scare it off. I decided on a middle ground. I shouted and banged a pot with a rock, hoping to make enough noise to scare the creature without attracting more attention. The rustling paused again, then gradually receded into the woods. I waited, tense, watching the shadows, until I felt confident it had moved on. Sleep didn't come easily after that. I stayed awake for hours, fire crackling, stick in hand, eyes scanning the darkness. Every sound made me jump. Small animals, the wind, the stream. It all sounded threatening now. I realized that the forest I had admired earlier was now a maze of unseen dangers. Morning brought relief, but also new challenges. The ground was damp, my supplies were low, and the memory of the previous night made me wary. I packed quickly, breaking camp efficiently, keeping my senses alert. I wanted to explore a little more before leaving, but carefully, sticking to areas where I could see my surroundings clearly. As I hiked down a narrow trail along the ridge, I noticed signs of larger animals. Deep footprints, broken branches, and claw marks on trees. Bears, maybe cougars. I felt the weight of isolation again. This part of the wilderness wasn't empty. It was alive, and I was intruding into territory that belonged to creatures far stronger than me. I decided to follow the stream downhill, reasoning that water sources often led to other trails or roads. The walk was slow. My legs were sore from climbing and hiking with my pack, but I kept going, listening carefully. The forest seemed quieter now, less ominous, but the memory of the previous night's rustling never left me. Every sound, every shadow made my heart race. Eventually, after hours of careful hiking, I emerged from the dense forest onto a broader trail. I recognized this path from a map. It led back toward a ranger station. Relief washed over me. I didn't run, but I quickened my pace, still scanning the woods. The sunlight felt warmer now, the world less threatening. I reached the ranger station by late afternoon, greeted by the sight of other campers and hikers. I explained briefly where I had been and what I experienced. They nodded, concerned but not surprised. Wildlife encounters in that area were common, and they reminded me gently of the dangers of hiking and camping alone. I spent the night at a nearby lodge, safe and warm, reflecting on the trip. The experience had been terrifying, but it taught me a lot about preparation, awareness, and respect for the wilderness. It wasn't a story of supernatural fear or fairy tale monsters. It was real, tangible danger. And I had survived because I stayed calm, stayed alert, and respected the power of the environment around me. I knew I would return to the mountains eventually, but with a greater understanding of the risks and more respect for the creatures and conditions that shared that space with me. By the next morning, I was back on the road home, exhausted but relieved. The city lights in the distance were comforting now, the sounds of traffic a strange form of safety. I thought about the fire in the clearing, the rustling in the darkness, the isolation, and I realized how lucky I had been. Not lucky in the sense of chance, but in the sense that I had made good decisions under pressure, and that I had respected the forest enough to survive. I didn't write about the experience to scare anyone. I wrote it because it reminded me how alive the world is outside our controlled spaces, and how quickly calm can turn to fear when the rules of civilization don't apply. The wilderness had tested me, and I had walked away intact. That knowledge gave me a strange sense of peace, stronger than the fear I had felt, and a deep respect for the silent, untamed world that exists just beyond the roads, waiting for those willing to enter it. I remember the morning I left for that trip with a mix of excitement and the usual tension I felt whenever I went camping alone. The air was cold, sharp, and biting, cutting through my hoodie as I loaded my car with supplies. I had my usual gear: a sturdy tent, sleeping bag, compact stove, a cooler packed with food, a backpack with essentials, and a first aid kit. I double-checked everything, because when you're planning to spend a few nights deep in the wilderness, mistakes could cost you. I had a map of the area, although I intended to follow a trail I had researched weeks before. The forest I was heading to was known for its isolation, rocky terrain, and unpredictable weather. That's exactly why I wanted it. I liked the quiet, the challenge, and the solitude. By mid-morning, I was driving down a narrow, winding road that eventually turned into a dirt path, each bump and pothole sending vibrations through my car. I could see the trees closing in on either side, their shadows stretching across the road in an almost solid wall of green. The deeper I drove, the more the human world faded. No more power lines, no houses, no passing cars. Just the rough trail and the sound of tires crunching on dirt. Eventually, the road ended, and I parked near a clearing that would serve as the starting point for my hike. I unloaded my gear and adjusted my backpack, feeling the weight on my shoulders. The forest stood tall around me, thick and silent, except for the occasional bird call or rustle of leaves. The first day was mostly uneventful. I followed the trail marked on my map, navigating around fallen trees, loose rocks, and occasional muddy patches. I passed by a small stream, its water clear but moving quickly, tumbling over rocks and making small splashes. The sound was calming. I stopped to refill my water bottle, crouching by the edge and letting the cool water run over my hands. I noticed small fish darting under the surface, the reflection of sunlight creating sparkles in the water. I felt safe and confident. I continued along the trail, keeping an eye on landmarks that matched my map. By late afternoon, I found a spot that looked perfect for camping. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a gentle slope leading to a larger clearing a few meters away. I set up my tent, making sure it was anchored firmly and my sleeping bag and gear were organized inside. I gathered wood for a fire and started preparing a simple meal: dehydrated pasta with canned vegetables. As I ate, I listened to the wind weaving through the trees, carrying the smell of pine needles and wet earth. It was peaceful. Night fell fast. The sun disappeared behind the trees, and the forest turned into a mass of shadows and dark shapes. I lit a small fire, letting the warmth and light keep me company. The sound of cracking wood filled the air, and I stared into the flames, thinking about the solitude. Around midnight, the forest became eerily quiet. Even the birds were gone. Only the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush reminded me of life. I lay in my tent, half listening to the fire, half dozing, feeling the tension in my body ease. I woke up abruptly a few hours later, not because of noise, but because the air felt heavier, more tense. My tent was shaking slightly, not from wind, but from small, rhythmic thumps outside. My heart started to race. I froze and listened. The sounds continued, deliberate and slow. They weren't the scurrying of deer or the tapping of branches in the wind. These were distinct, heavy thumps, moving closer to my tent. My first instinct was to hide, but there was nowhere to hide in a small tent, and the thought of staying still while something approached terrified me. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent slowly, peering into the darkness. I could barely see, but the beam of the flashlight caught movement. At first, I thought it was a large animal, maybe a bear or a wild boar. But there was no growling, no scent of musk, just the sound of deliberate, slow steps. The forest was too quiet to ignore this. My mind raced. Should I stay in the tent and hope it passed? Or should I try to leave? I decided the best option was to get out and make some noise, hoping it would scare whatever it was off. I grabbed a metal stick I had collected for protection and stepped out of the tent carefully. The air was cold, my breath visible in the flashlight's beam. I swung the stick gently, making clattering noises against rocks and tree roots. The sound echoed unnaturally in the still forest. That's when I saw it. Not a bear, not a wild animal, but a person. A man, tall, thin, wearing clothes that blended with the forest. He didn't run, didn't speak, just stood there watching me. My stomach dropped. I could feel my pulse in my throat. He had a backpack and what looked like camping gear, but he wasn't following the trail. He was somewhere in the trees, just waiting. I tried to make myself appear larger, swinging the stick and shouting in my own voice, which sounded shaky even to me. The man didn't react immediately. Then, slowly, he moved sideways, keeping his distance, staying partially hidden behind trees. I realized he had been following me without my knowledge, moving quietly through the forest while I had been focused on hiking and setting up camp. My fear spiked. I didn't know his intentions, and that uncertainty was worse than anything I had imagined. I decided I had to leave. I grabbed my backpack, leaving the fire to burn out, and started down the trail toward the clearing where I had parked my car. The man didn't pursue immediately. I kept my flashlight on, scanning for any movement. My legs were shaking, and every sound, snap of a twig, rustle of leaves, made me jump. I kept moving, sometimes breaking into a run, sometimes walking carefully to avoid making too much noise. The forest seemed endless, the trail twisting and turning in ways I hadn't noticed before. I came across a small stream again. The water was dark now, reflecting the moonlight. I had to cross it, and as I stepped on the slippery rocks, I almost fell. My heart pounded so loudly I thought he could hear it. I made it across and continued, desperate to reach the road. After what felt like hours, I finally saw the headlights of my car through the trees. Relief washed over me, But I didn't slow down. I ran the last few meters, threw my backpack in the back seat, and locked the doors. I sat there for a long time, catching my breath, listening for any sign of him. Nothing. The forest was quiet again, but I knew he was still out there somewhere. I drove slowly back down the dirt road, eyes scanning every shadow, every movement. When I finally reached the main road, I felt the tension in my body start to fade. Streetlights and occasional cars gave me a sense of safety I hadn't realized I missed so much. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about that man. The way he had moved silently through the forest, following me without detection, unsettled me more than anything else I had experienced. I reported the encounter to the local ranger station, giving them the location and description, and they told me they had received similar reports of people wandering in the area and following campers. The idea that someone could be out there, unafraid of confrontation, watching and tracking people in the woods, changed how I viewed camping entirely. I never returned to that forest alone. The experience taught me a lot about preparation, awareness, and the reality that the wilderness is not just about nature, it's about people too, and sometimes the most dangerous things are other humans. I started going to more populated campgrounds or always taking a partner with me. I kept camping because I loved it too much to give it up, but I never ignored the potential dangers again. Months later, I revisited the trail, this time with a friend, and I noticed subtle signs of human presence. Footprints in the mud, broken branches that weren't caused by nature, small caches of discarded items. It confirmed my fear that someone had been stalking campers, watching them, and sometimes even following them. Knowing I had escaped was both terrifying and relieving. The forest hadn't changed, but my perception had. Every crack of a branch, every shadow of a tree, now reminded me to be cautious. That summer, I decided to take precautions that seemed excessive to some friends. I carried a GPS tracker, extra food, pepper spray, a whistle, and a signal mirror. I even reviewed wilderness survival techniques I had never thought I'd need, like creating improvised shelters quickly, finding safe water sources, and moving quietly while staying alert. It became more than camping. It became preparation for an encounter I hoped would never happen again. Eventually, I came to realize that the fear I felt that night wasn't just about that one man. It was about the vulnerability of being alone, the fragile balance between confidence and danger. That forest hadn't changed, but my awareness had, and that awareness allowed me to enjoy the outdoors safely. I still hike, I still camp, and I still seek solitude in nature, but I do it with respect for the wilderness and for the fact that not all threats are visible, and some can follow silently until it's almost too late.